The Galactic Conclave had a problem. Not the kind of problem you solve with a strongly worded memo, or a diplomatic summit, or even a carefully arranged trade embargo. No, this was the kind of problem that made 7-star admirals go quiet in meetings. The kind that made the Veth High Council cancel their annual feast of honored victories and sit, instead, in complete, suffocating silence. The problem had a name, and that name was humanity. Now, before you get all teary-eyed and proud about that, let me give you the full picture, because the full picture is both more impressive and more embarrassing than you might expect. Impressive for the humans. Embarrassing, well, for everyone else. It started, as most galactic disasters do, with someone underestimating someone else. The Conclave had been watching the Terran species for roughly 4 of their centuries. 4 centuries of taking notes, running projections, building threat models, and ultimately concluding, with the full confidence of 17 unified civilizations behind them, that humanity was, at best, a mid-tier nuisance. Aggressive, certainly. Unpredictable, occasionally. Dangerous in the way that a cornered animal is dangerous, meaning briefly and without real consequence. They were wrong. Spectacularly, historically, cosmically wrong. But they didn't know that yet. On the morning Supreme Commander Vreth Kolashari called together the Conclave's most decorated military minds and laid out the plan that would go down in galactic history. Not as a triumph, not as a campaign, but as a cautionary tale that gets told to young officers before their first real deployment, always with the same ending, and that is why you never assume. Vreth Kolashari was not a small creature. The Veth were never small. They stood somewhere between 2 and 3 meters depending on the individual's caste, their exoskeletal plating layered like architectural armor, their 4 primary eyes capable of processing light across 13 spectral bands. They were ancient, proud. They had been a spacefaring civilization when humans were still arguing about whether the sun went around the planet or the planet went around the sun. And yet, standing at the head of that obsidian briefing table, surrounded by the finest military intellects in the known galaxy, Vreth Kolashari made a mistake that would haunt the Conclave for generations. He said the words, the actual words, out loud, in front of witnesses. This is a one-way mission. The room went very still. Not because the concept was shocking. One-way missions existed. They were rare, but they existed, and every military in the galaxy understood the mathematics of acceptable losses when the objective was important enough. No, the room went still because of what came next. We are sending the best. We are sending everything we have deemed necessary, and we are not expecting them to come back, because after what they accomplish, there will be nothing left on that planet worth coming back from. He meant it as resolve. The room heard it as certainty. Neither interpretation would survive contact with Terra. The force they assembled was not modest. Let me be very clear about that, because later, much later, there would be those in the Conclave who tried to claim the mission had never been meant as a serious effort, that it was exploratory, that the losses were within projected parameters. All of that is what historians, when they are being polite, call revisionist fiction, and what everyone else calls lying. The Conclave sent the Vel-Shathari. Translated loosely into human terms, the name meant the shattering hand, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously they were taking this. 12 warships. Not patrol ships, not escorts. Warships built in the orbital foundries of the Dracian Collective, which had been constructing instruments of destruction for longer than humanity had possessed written language. Each vessel carried between 400 and 900 combat-rated personnel. The Vel-Shathari's flagship alone, the immovable Conviction, had enough firepower to crack a moon. They also sent the Oroth Kel. That one doesn't translate as poetically. It means something closer to the ones who finish things, which is less dramatic but arguably more terrifying in practice. These were special operations units, drawn from 6 different Conclave species, each one selected for capability in low visibility, high lethality operations. Their commander was a being named Desavrik Tun, a Harak, who had 17 confirmed planetary pacification operations to her name. 17 planets, pacified. She looked at the tactical files on humanity and said, with the flat, professional certainty of someone who had done this many times before, "We will be finished within 8 of their days." She was not finished in 8 days. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at a distance that human sensors could detect but not yet meaningfully respond to. This was standard doctrine. You give them enough time to see you coming, but not enough time to do anything useful about it. The psychological advantage of watching something unstoppable approach is, in most civilizations, sufficient to collapse resistance before the first shot is ever fired. Humanity, it turned out, did not read the standard doctrine. The first signal they received from Terra was not a surrender broadcast. It was not a diplomatic hail. It was not even the standard emergency military encryption that every civilization used when attempting to buy time. It was, and the Conclave's signal analysts spent 3 full days confirming this before reporting it upward, a human military frequency carrying what appeared to be music. Old music, very old music by human standards. Something with a driving rhythm and a repetitive chord progression that the analysts flagged as culturally significant but strategically meaningless. They attached a note to the report saying the humans were likely broadcasting in error, possibly due to a malfunction in their communications array. The music was not a malfunction. In a converted industrial facility on the eastern edge of what humans called the European continent, a woman named Britta Valenson was sitting in front of a communications board that had been patched, illegally and brilliantly, into humanity's entire defense coordination network. Beside her, eating something that smelled aggressively of garlic, was a man named Duro Fakete, who was in the process of finishing what he would later describe as the single most important spreadsheet in human military history. Duro was not military. He had been, for the previous 11 years, an actuary for a shipping insurance company. He calculated risk for a living. He looked at numbers and understood, intuitively and precisely, what they meant. He looked at the numbers on the incoming Conclave fleet and said, "Okay, so they think this is going to be easy." Britta looked at him. "Is it going to be easy?" Duro ate another piece of his garlic bread. For them? No. What Duro had done, in the 72 hours between first detection of the incoming fleet and this particular moment, was something the Conclave's most decorated strategic minds had genuinely not anticipated. He had modeled them, not as a military force, not as a political entity, but as a logistical system. Because Duro Fakete had spent 11 years learning that every system, no matter how powerful, has a point at which cost exceeds capacity. You just had to find it. He found it. But across the void of space, aboard the immovable Conviction, no one knew that yet. What they knew was that the human defensive formation was strange. Not alarming. Strange. The ships they were seeing on long-range sensors did not match any known configuration in the tactical database. They were smaller than expected, faster than expected, and arranged in a pattern that Vreth Kolashari's tactical officer, a meticulous Dracian named Sev Orath Klin, spent considerable time staring at before admitting he wasn't entirely certain what it meant. "It's not a standard defensive perimeter," Sev said carefully. "Because they don't have a standard," Vreth said. "They've had perhaps 40 years of real spaceflight. They're improvising." "Yes," Sev agreed. And then, because he was meticulous, he added, "I'm not sure that's reassuring." It wasn't. The first engagement happened 12 hours after the fleet achieved high orbit. The Conclave sent 3 warships to neutralize what sensors identified as humanity's primary orbital defense platform, a massive, ungainly thing that looked like someone had welded several different ships together in the dark, which, as it turned out, was more or less what had happened. The platform's name, according to intercepted human communications, was the Persistent Argument. The human assigned to command it was a man named Caius Berber, who had previously commanded a deep space mining operation and who, by every measure the Conclave had for military competency, should not have been a threat to 3 of their warships. Caius Berber did not fight the 3 warships the way they expected to be fought. He ran from them. Specifically, he ran from them in a direction that took all 3 pursuing vessels through a debris field that humanity had apparently seeded in the previous 40 hours with objects the Conclave's sensors initially classified as inert junk. Old satellites, defunct equipment, fragments of what appeared to be retired spacecraft. They were not junk. The first warship understood this approximately 4 seconds before the others did. That was not enough time to warn them. The debris field wasn't a minefield, exactly. It was more sophisticated than that, and more chaotic, and significantly more devastating. And by the time the remaining 2 warships pulled clear, Both of them were compromised enough that Vreth Kolashari made the call to withdraw them from frontline operations. He lost 3 warships in the first engagement. 3. Against a decommissioned mining platform commanded by an actuary's plan and a former mining operator's instincts. Vreth did not panic. He was too experienced to panic, but he did something that among the Veth was considered a significant tell. He went very, very quiet. And then he sent for Desavrik Tun. The Orath Kel were not meant to deploy until the orbital phase was complete. That was the plan. Orbital superiority first, then ground operations, then the long, methodical process that Desavrik had performed on 17 other worlds. But the plan was already adjusting, bending around the strange shape of human resistance, and Vreth had decided that the Orath Kel's deployment needed to move forward. Desavrik listened to the updated briefing without expression. The Harak were not expressive creatures by nature. They communicated intent through posture and eye movement, and right now Desavrik's posture communicated something that her adjutant, a young Veth named Keth Soravar, had never seen from her in 6 years of service. Caution. The ground teams, Desavrik said. How much do we know about what's waiting for them? Standard projections based on known human military doctrine, Keth said. Desavrik looked at him for a long moment. Find me projections based on what they have actually done in the last 72 hours. Keth went to find those projections. He came back looking like he needed to sit down, because down on the surface of Terra, in dozens of locations across every continent, humanity was not panicking. Humanity was not surrendering. Humanity was not even, as far as the Conclave's intelligence could determine, particularly afraid. Humanity was preparing, and the preparations looked nothing like anything in the database. They looked, if Keth was being honest, and he was trying very hard to be honest in his report to Desavrik, like something you designed if you had studied every single recorded alien invasion in galactic history and specifically engineered a response to all of them simultaneously, which of course was exactly what they had done. Duro Fekete had finished his spreadsheet. Desavrik Tun had a rule. It was a simple rule, the kind of rule that sounds obvious until you meet the people who forgot to follow it and are no longer around to explain what went wrong. The rule was this: when the enemy does something you did not predict, stop, reassess. Do not proceed on the assumption that the next thing they do will be predictable. 17 planetary pacifications. 17, and not once, in any of those operations, had she broken that rule. She almost broke it on Terra. The pressure from above was considerable. Vreth Kolashari was not a commander who tolerated delay. The Veth philosophy of warfare was built on momentum, on the principle that a force in motion generated its own advantages, and a force that stopped, even briefly, surrendered those advantages to the enemy. He wanted the Orath Kel on the ground within 6 hours. He wanted cities secured, infrastructure neutralized, command structures decapitated. Desavrik requested 12 hours instead. Vreth gave her 9. In those 9 hours, Desavrik did something none of her previous operations had required. She sat down with the intelligence files on humanity. Not the tactical summaries, not the threat assessments, not the clean, confident projections that had been handed to Vreth before departure. She read the raw data, the unprocessed feeds, the intercepted communications that the analysts had flagged as low priority because they didn't match any known military format. Most of it was, on the surface, baffling. Humans talked to each other in ways that military intelligence had difficulty categorizing. There was humor embedded in crisis communications. There was argument, loud and sustained argument, embedded in what appeared to be strategic planning sessions. There were references she couldn't parse, cultural shorthand that meant nothing to a Harak who had spent her career studying military systems and very little time studying the species that ran them. But underneath all of it, beneath the noise and the strangeness, she found the thing she was looking for, the shape of what they were doing. She called her senior team leads together. There were 4 of them. Preeth Valos, a Dracian who specialized in urban operations. Min Orak, a Vel, a species of remarkable perceptual acuity, who handled reconnaissance and infiltration. Sorvek Duas, the oldest member of the Orath Kel, a Harak like Desavrik herself with 30 years of fieldwork behind him, and Keleth, who was young and sharp, and from a species called the Tavrani, who nobody in the Conclave had initially wanted to include in the Orath Kel, until Keleth's first 3 operations made the argument for inclusion rather definitively. Desavrik put the intelligence summary in front of them and said, "Tell me what you see." Preeth Valos spoke first, because the Drassian always spoke first. It was a cultural habit, and not even Desavrik had managed to train it out of him. "They've fortified the wrong positions." "Have they?" Desavrik said. It was not a question. Preeth hesitated, looked again. "They've fortified positions that have no obvious strategic value. These locations here, here, and here. Remote, difficult terrain, limited infrastructure. If I were defending a planet, I would not." "You would defend the cities," Minorak said quietly. The Vel's voice was always quiet. Their vocal anatomy didn't produce volume easily, but it produced precision like nothing else. Population centers, industrial production, command infrastructure. That is what we are targeting. That is what any rational defense prioritizes. And they know that, Keleth said. Everyone looked at Keleth. Keleth was doing the thing Keleth always did when something clicked into place. A very slight forward lean, barely perceptible, like a sensor array orienting toward a signal. They know exactly what we're targeting. The question isn't what they're defending. The question is what they're doing in the places they're not defending. 9 hours of analysis. 9 hours of Desavrik's best people pulling apart human decision-making with every tool available to the Orath Kel. And at the end of it, Desavrik went back to Vreth Kolashari and said 3 words that she had never, in 17 operations, said to a commanding officer before. "I need more time." Vreth looked at her for a long moment. Vreth was not a being who showed uncertainty either. Among the Veth, visible uncertainty in command was a social failure with lasting consequences. But something in Desavrik's posture, some quality of the way she was standing, made him ask a question instead of issuing an order. "How much more time?" "I don't know," Desavrik said. Vreth gave her 6 hours. He should have given her more. He knew, later, that he should have given her more. But the Conclave was watching, and the mission timeline was already behind, and a one-way mission is not one way if the force conducting it returns empty-handed. So Desavrik deployed with 6 hours of additional analysis and a certainty she did not fully feel, and the Orath Kel dropped into Terra's atmosphere in 48 insertion pods, scatter-patterned across 6 continents, precisely coordinated, ruthlessly efficient. 31 of the 48 pods reached their landing zones without incident. The other 17 did not. This is where it gets complicated to explain. Because what happened to those 17 pods was not the result of human weapons, or human tactical planning, or anything that appeared in the intelligence files. What happened was that 14 of the 17 pods were redirected, mid-descent, by a human communication system that should not have had the capability to interface with Orath Kel insertion hardware, and absolutely should not have been able to override pod navigation, and definitely should not have been able to do it to 17 pods simultaneously. It did all 3 of those things. Later, much later, the Conclave would learn that the system responsible had been designed by a 26-year-old from a city called Nairobi, a woman named Amina Osei, who had originally built it as part of a graduate thesis on signal vulnerability in automated navigation systems. Amina had spent 2 years trying to get someone in the human defense establishment to pay attention to her research. 2 years of being told the vulnerabilities she'd identified were theoretical, and the methodology was too unconventional. Then the Conclave fleet appeared on long-range sensors, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk to Amina Osei. She had 72 hours to adapt her theoretical vulnerability into a working system. She worked on approximately 4 hours of sleep, sustained by what witnesses described as an industrial quantity of coffee and a focused, almost serene sense of purpose that one of her colleagues would later describe, in a widely read account of the invasion, as the most frightening thing I have ever seen on a human face. 14 pods landed in locations of Amina's choosing. 3 crashed. The crash landings were not intentional. The system was, Amina would freely admit, not fully refined. She lost 3 nights of sleep over those 3 pods. She did not, it should be noted, lose any sleep over the 14. For the 31 pods that landed on target, the Orath Kel found their landing zones empty. Prepared, clearly. Recently vacated, clearly, but empty. The humans who should have been there were not there, and the equipment that should have been there, defense emplacements, communication arrays, the infrastructure of resistance that the intelligence files had specifically identified as priority targets, was also not there. Sorvek Dues, landing in the remnants of what had been a major human military coordination center, looked at the empty building around him and said, in the flat tone of someone describing a problem they have not yet solved, they moved everything. Prith Valos, 1,200 kilometers away, was looking at the same thing. How much warning did they have? From first detection to now? Sorvek Dues calculated. Approximately 91 of their hours. They relocated a planetary defense infrastructure in 91 hours. Sorvek Dues looked around the empty building one more time. Apparently, what Sorvek Dues did not know, and what would take the Conclave's analysts another several days to piece together, was that the relocation had not been a reactive measure. It had not been implemented in the 91 hours between detection and deployment. It had been planned, not for this specific invasion, not with foreknowledge of the Conclave's timeline, but in the general, perpetual, entirely characteristic human fashion of assuming that something bad was eventually going to happen, and making sure you had a plan for it when it did. The man responsible for the original plan was named Fortunato Burak, and he had been retired for 11 years by the time the Velshathari arrived in Terra's orbit. Fortunato had spent 30 years in human strategic planning, had written extensively about the vulnerabilities of centralized defense infrastructure, and had specifically advocated for what he called a distributed resilience model, meaning you build your real capacity in places nobody would think to look, and keep your obvious installations just obvious enough to be convincing. Nobody had listened to Fortunato either. He had retired mildly bitter about this. Then, Duro Fakete called him. Because Duro had read Fortunato's papers while building his spreadsheet, and Duro had a gift for recognizing when someone had already solved the problem you were currently panicking about. Fortuna took the call on his front porch. He listened to the situation summary in silence. He asked 2 clarifying questions, and then he said, I'll need a large staff and complete authority over logistics, and someone needs to find my old files. They found his files. He had a very large staff. And now, as the Orath Kel moved through empty buildings and evacuated positions, Fortunato Burak was sitting in an underground coordination center in an undisclosed location, surrounded by the people who had finally started listening, watching 31 insertion pods worth of the galaxy's finest special operations units search systematically for something that wasn't there. Desavrik knew something was wrong within the first 2 hours of ground operations. She felt it before she had evidence for it, which was the Harak equivalent of an alarm system, a deep instinctive processing of accumulated data that didn't surface as conscious thought, but absolutely surfaced as a feeling of profound wrongness. She was in what had been identified as a regional command post. It was thoroughly empty, but it wasn't empty in the way of a hasty evacuation. There was no abandoned equipment, no scattered documents, no signs of rapid departure. It was empty in the way of a space that had been deliberately, carefully, completely cleared by people who had taken their time. She contacted Vreth. They knew exactly where we were going. That's not possible, Vreth said. The targeting data was compiled from long-range observation and algorithmic projection. It was not transmitted on any channel they could have accessed. I know, Desavrik said. And yet, Vreth was quiet for a moment. Recommendations. Pull back to orbit, Desavrik said. Regroup, reanalyze. There was a longer pause. The Conclave is watching. I know, Desavrik said again. A withdrawal, even a temporary one, will be interpreted as, I know what it will be interpreted as, Desavrik said. I also know that we are currently conducting ground operations against an enemy we cannot locate, in a theater that has been specifically prepared to receive us, and that every hour we spend on this planet we are operating on their terms and not ours. Another pause. Longer. I'll authorize a phased extraction, Vreth said. You have 4 hours. She pulled her teams in 2 hours and 50 minutes, not because she was efficient, though she was, because in the last hour of those 4, Min Orak, whose perceptual acuity had made her the best reconnaissance operative in the Orath Kel for 15 years, reported something that made even Min Orak sound unsettled. They're following us, Min said. Define following. Matching our movement. Keeping distance. Not engaging. A pause. Observing. And that, right there, was the moment Desavrik finally and completely understood what Duro Fakete's spreadsheet had concluded 72 hours earlier. The thing that humanity had understood about the Conclave, that the Conclave had never understood about itself. They were not trying to defeat the Orath-Kel. They were studying them. Every team, every technique, every piece of equipment and tactical decision and operational response, all 91 hours of detection time, had not been spent building defenses, they had been spent setting up observation. Humanity had looked at the finest special operations force in the known galaxy and decided that the most valuable thing they could do was learn from them, up close, in real time. When the Orath-Kel reached orbit and the last insertion pod locked into the bay of the immovable conviction, Vreth Kolashari called a command conference that lasted 6 hours. At the end of it, he filed the report that the Conclave had been waiting for. It did not say mission accomplished. It did not say within projected parameters. It said in the precise and formal language of Veth military reporting that the operation had encountered conditions not anticipated by pre-mission analysis, that the Terran species had demonstrated adaptive and predictive capabilities that exceeded threat model projections by a margin that required recategorization, and that his recommendation was an immediate and indefinite suspension of hostile operations pending a comprehensive strategic review. The Conclave read the report. Then they read the casualty figures. Then they read the intelligence analysis on what humanity had managed to accomplish with 91 hours and no formal warning. They called an emergency session. It lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, they sent a diplomatic signal to Terra. Not a demand. A signal, requesting for the first time in the Conclave's 400-year history to open a dialogue with a species they had arrived intending to erase. The signal was received by Britta Valenson, who was still at her communications board, and who had at this point been awake for an impressively inadvisable number of hours. She stared at the signal for a full 30 seconds. Then she called Duro. "They want to talk," she said. Duro was quiet for a moment. "Of course they do. How did you know this would happen?" There was the sound of him eating, probably garlic bread. "Because every system has a point where cost exceeds capacity," he said. "I just had to find it." Fortunato Burak, when he heard the news, sat on his front porch for a long time. He thought about 30 years of people not listening. He thought about 11 years of retirement. He thought about the files they'd finally found. Then he went inside and made himself a cup of coffee and started writing the follow-up paper. It was titled, simply, "What Happens Next?" He had a feeling people were going to read this one. Across the void, aboard the immovable conviction, Desavrik Toon sat in her quarters and reviewed the operational logs one final time. 17 pacifications. 17 worlds where the plan had held and the outcome had followed the model. And then one world where a retired logistics theorist and an insurance actuary and a graduate student with a signal vulnerability thesis had collectively turned the finest military operation in galactic history into a very expensive research project for the enemy. She saved the logs, closed the file, opened a new one, and began writing the most important operational report of her career, the one that started with, "We were wrong about them, here is everything we got wrong, and here is why we will not make the same mistake twice." She paused, added one more line, "And here is why I do not believe they will make any mistake twice either." She filed it without revision. It was, everyone agreed later, the most honest document the Orath-Kel had ever produced. It was also, as Vreth Kolashari read it in silence on the long journey home, the most frightening,